the migration of Jews from Aleppo and Damascus to Mexico, the Convergences and Divergences at the beginning of the 20th century. I want to thank very much for the invitation to Professor Yaron Harel, to Professor Totanara, and also to Mr. Marcos Meta for having me. I'm very honored to be here on this afternoon. Well, let's start then. On the second half of the 19th century and the first of the 20th, at the Ottoman Empire and all the Middle East region, there were transitating for a process of modernization that was received in different manners by the communities in Aleppo and Damascus. If we try to speak about the convergences between these two communities, we can say that they both use the Arab language and also Hebrew for worship purposes. They both practice the Jewish religion, and they have day-to-day customs, and also the social and kinship relationships were very similar. They were endogamic primarily, and it is important that on this time there was these adjustments in the structure, in the social structure of the Ottoman Empire that affected both communities in the internal order. Like, for example, the Tanzimat reforms or also the Young Turk Revolution had an impact on the military service of the young men, or like, for example, the citizenship equality that in fact substituted the millet system that was before. Or also it is important to mention the economic deterioration that was taking place in this period of time, and then and that was similar in both. Nevertheless, there were also divergences between the two communities. Like, for example, the territorial ecosystem of Aleppo and Damascus is different. Aleppo is situated in a desert, has importance in the regional commerce, has like a Bedouin culture also, much more traditional, and much more religion-centered activities. In the other side, in Damascus, they are much more near the Mediterranean Sea. They have cultural contacts with Europe, with Africa, with Asia. They practice the international commerce also. So this made that the religiosity much more flexible, and of course the ideas from the Mediterranean, from Europe, were much more fluent than what happened with the Aleppo Jews in that sense. The Aleppo Jews felt like were very religious. They felt like the guardians of the millenary Jewish inheritance of the Middle East. And this is very interesting, like, for example, in the symbolic way that the Keter had, the rabbinic authorities, and also the way the halachic precepts were observed. So this is difference that the migrants will bring with them to the new spaces where they installed. In the case of Damascus, it's important that they were very conscious of the community integrity, but they were more open to new ideas. And this can be evident, for example, in the assistance of the majority of the children and the young persons to the Alliance Israelite Universelle, that was this French school where they learned the language and learned the culture with the European eyes perspectives. So it is important. And well, in this context of deterioration, as we were speaking, migration was seen as an alternative. So we can find at the beginning, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we can find the first wave of migration to America, as they call it. It's important to say that it was not just America. Another Jews fled, like for example, to Egypt, or like to Paris, or London, or any other places in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. But they also came to America. And the question that rises in this moment is, why Mexico? Why did they arrive to Mexico? And what we can say is that they had like a partial knowledge of the geography of other continents in that case, and go to America and come and go into America was like an idea that was full of myths, but also of realities and things, and they imagined a world that they didn't really knew, no? So maybe that was why they arrived here, no, to Mexico, because they didn't know where they were arriving, to what port they were going to get. So the first migrants from Aleppo and Damascus very probably came by an error to Mexico. But it is very interesting to speak about the characteristic of the migration to Mexico. It was like in a chain, because they sent letters to one another, and they wrote of what they were experiencing, what they were seeing, so other people wanted to have the same experience, and they started to interchange letters. That was a very important way of communicating. And on the other side, the migration was not an individual enterprise. It was a collective one. What do I mean? There were whole families, for nuclear family cells that moved from Aleppo or Damascus to Mexico. There were also heads of family, men, that also wanted to come, make money, and go back to the place of origin. That was also in the first wave. But basically what we have is young men that were sent by their own families to have a chance and see what happens in new spaces. Like for example, a couple, I don't know, a number of families, they make a deal. That have, like for example, young young men between 13 and 18 years old. They were all in a group together to make the transfer, the route from Aleppo and Damascus to Mexico in this case. It is very important to say that this is a very special moment in the history of mankind because, and they were inserted in this horizon, in this historical horizon that made possible the route or the transfer from one place to another. The first thing that we can say is that they had, although limited, they had some financial resources to buy the ticket and have sufficient money to survive this transfer. And on the other way, it is important to say that they had access to identity documents, legal documents, so that they could make this transfer again. But on the other hand, it is important to say that in the technological point of view, we have in this moment trains, a lot of train routes that could take them from their places of origin to the ports first in the Mediterranean Sea, like for example Beirut, and from there they took a boat that crossed the Mediterranean, and there were also transatlantic vehicles that could make the journey all the way to the Americas in this case. So they had the means to do this. Okay, the first wave of immigrants that came to Mexico, they arrived more or less between 1906 and 1908, and they came, I think the first one came from Damascus, but they came also from Aleppo very few years later. So they wanted to go primarily to the United States, but they arrived in a Mexican port. The three principal Mexican ports that we can mention were Veracruz, that was the very principal, almost everyone came by that via. But there were also Tampico port and also Progreso in Yucatan, and so there were very few requirements to enter the country. The only thing that was very strict was a sickness that some migrants had that was called trachoma, and this sickness was in the eyes and was very contagious. So the person, they were checked by a health professional to see if they didn't have this trachoma, and if they had, they were sent back in the same boat to their origin. So it was very difficult to enter when they had these things. But that was almost all that was required to enter the new place. It's very interesting to revise the testimonies of the immigrants. For them, getting to Mexico, especially to Veracruz, was a different world. Like, for example, how the persons looked, what they used in their clothes, the food, the customs, and everything that they were looking at. It was like another world for them. When they got to Veracruz, they stayed at very little time there, and they took a train to the Mexico City. It's important to say that the French that they learned at the Alliance facilitated the communication in Spanish when they arrived here. Also, it is very interesting to say that with this first wave, they came rabbis also. They immigrated, they immigrated. The rabbis came with these groups of persons, and they also had the same migratory experience. And they had a very important role to play because they morally regulated the group, and also socially and religiosity were important at the beginnings of the formation of the community. So I think their presence was an ideological element very necessary in this to maintain the cohesion of the groups since the beginning of the community. If we talk about the communitary organization, we can say that we can find common elements and also diverse elements in the experience of the Aleppo and the Damascus members, Jews of the community. During this time, there were arriving Jews from many places, from different procedences, and also non-Jews. The migration was general from Europe, Asia, and Africa to America, and that was not different. But in the case of the Jews, they came from, for example, West Europe, Central, East Europe, from the Sephardi world, like, for example, Greece or Crete or Bulgaria. But they also came from the Middle East, specifically from Aleppo and Damascus. They were Arab speakers, no? The Sephardis were Ladino speakers in that way, and the European were primarily Yiddish speaking, no? So that was a very important particularity of each of those groups that were here. We are talking about that there were not so many families in that time in Mexico. Maybe there were 30, 40 families from different procedences that were here. But they had a collective need that independently from where they came from, they needed that. And so that was the thing that made the first communal organization in Mexico to be formed. And I'm talking about the cemetery. And because in that time there were not a lot of dead people and Jews, there were not so many, but eventually there was the necessity to use a cemetery for the dead people. And it is very important because that denotes alignment to the place. So the first cemetery was the Monte Sinai, and it was established in the Mexico City in the street of Tacuba. That is still in use by the Alianza Monte Sinai. In 1912, it was the creation of the Alianza Monte Sinai. That was the first organization, Jewish organization in the modern Mexico that was formed by the Jews of different procedences, and that was like we can say like the cradle of what is going to be after. And I would like to talk about briefly about the second decade in Mexico City. It was a hostile milieu for the first wave Jews that arrived to Mexico City, and because in 1910 there was an explosion of a revolution in Mexico. The dictator was out, and the different factions, political and military factions around the Republic, around the Mexican Republic, arise and started to in a military conflict one with another. This came with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of danger and other things, no? And especially it was very difficult to the commercial activities that the migrants had in that time. They just that I can say that 80% of the population in Mexico in that time was rural, so people had to transit in the train, and the train was the most insecure space in that time, because they blew the trains. And it was part of this war that was taking place within the country. So this also, it's very important to say, this movement is coincident also with the First World War. So what happens, in fact, is that the migration process stops because it's not secure to take a transatlantic in these times. So it was very limited, the movement, the migration movements that were taking place in that time. So that was what happened. It's important to say that during this decade, the kinship relationships were very important. They really acted as cohesion, as a form of cohesion of the communitary networks that were there, and it was important. Nevertheless, by 1918, the situation was much more better, because it was the end of the First World War, it was the end of the Mexican Revolution. So it starts the second wave, the second migratory wave from all the places, and this includes the Middle East, from to Mexico, America, and Latin America also. So what happens is that we see a very important increase in the population, in the Jewish population also, to Mexico City, and this increase makes that this first organization, the Alianza Montesinai, starts to diversify itself from internal, so that the Jews from different procedences, from different places of origin, organize each other. So the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazim Jews from Europe, they organize their own institutions. The Sephardic Ladino speakers, they organize also their own institutions. And in Alianza Montesinai, that was the first and the original organization, they stayed also just the Aleppo and the Damascus Jews there, no? So it is interesting because what we see here is the dynamics of these similarities and differences of the Jews and their cultures, and that express different and particular situations where there emerge these convergences and divergences that we are talking about. In the case of the immigrants of the Aleppo and Damascus in the decade of the 20s, the encounters were more than the disencounters. Nevertheless, the second ones, these last ones, led to the separation of the communitary institutions. The tensions that were manifested and that led to these differences was, the first one was the administration in the use of the cemetery that generated a lot of tensions, and another one was the creation, in fact, creation of parallel institutions in the two communities, like for example the Kitab, this is the religious school for the children, the women's organizations, the welfare institutions also, and also the worship places where they were. So in fact they were acting in the day-to-day practice in their own spaces. And yes, there were also many times some familiar conflicts, and it was very interesting because the Halabis from Aleppo stand aside from the Halabi member in conflict, and the Damascene, the Shami members stand aside from the Shami person in conflict. So this a conflict between two converted in a communitary conflict that could generate a lot of tensions between them. But their customs, their way of life, the relationships, the families were known in both communities, and still today they are like brothers, but have their own institutional organizations that function very well in that way. It is interesting because today we are like in the 5th or 6th generation of Jews from Aleppo and Damascus, and the place of origin is still one of the important reference for the identification of the person, of the people in the community. But it is interesting to say that the level of observance, of religious observance, is what today is changing, and it's giving the reference for the community affiliation. So thank you very much for this time with you. And I hope we have some other opportunities to speak about this process of integration and this and the characteristic and particularities of the diaspora of Aleppo and Damascus Jews in the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. It was interesting very much. אני רוצה להזמין את דותן, אלא אם כן יש איזושהי שאלה. אני רוצה להזמין את דותן לדברי סיכום. I want to say thank you very much. It was very interesting. It's give me something to think about after. Thank you. דותן, דברי סיכום של הכנס החשוב הזה, זה סיכום של יומיים חשובים ומשמעותיים, גם אתמול, גם היום, אז הבמה של האדם החשוב של הכנס הזה.
טוב, אז... את האורות שלה. נאמר